Here's a question that might surprise you. If you could choose any rifle in World War II, any rifle at all, would you really pick the StG44? Most people would say yes, instantly. And honestly, that makes sense. The StG44 is the gun that shows up in every most influential weapons ever made list. It's the one historians call the grandfather of the modern assault rifle. It's the one that supposedly made Hitler himself excited enough to rename it. So yeah, on paper, it sounds like the obvious choice. But here's the thing, and this is what most YouTube channels skip over. The soldiers actually using these weapons didn't always agree with that ranking. There were real experienced combat veterans who, given the choice, would have reached for the M1 Carbine instead. Not because they didn't know better, but because they knew something the historians writing decades later sometimes forgot. A weapon isn't good or bad in the abstract. It's good or bad for a specific person, in a specific situation, doing a specific job. And when you look at things through that lens, the M1 Carbine starts to make a whole lot more sense. So today, we're going to dig into both of these weapons, honestly fairly without the hype, and figure out exactly why some soldiers genuinely preferred the M1 Carbine over the StG44. Not all soldiers, not in every situation, but enough soldiers in enough situations that it's worth taking seriously. Let's get into it. Before we compare them, we need to understand something fundamental. These two weapons were not designed with the same soldier in mind. The StG44, the Sturmgewehr 44, was designed to be a primary infantry weapon, something that could replace the standard rifle for frontline soldiers engaging the enemy at battlefield distances. The Germans wanted something that could do what a full rifle did at medium range, but with more firepower and a manageable weight. That was the design goal. A weapon for the guy in the thick of it. The M1 Carbine had a completely different origin story. The US Army looked at a specific group of soldiers and realized they had a problem. Officers, radio operators, mortar crews, vehicle crews, engineers, medical personnel. All these people were carrying the M1 Garand, which is a phenomenal rifle, but it's also heavy, long, and requires two hands to use effectively. These weren't soldiers whose primary job was to engage the enemy directly. Their primary job was something else. Leading men, calling in coordinates, driving a jeep, treating wounds. The rifle was supposed to be a secondary tool for personal defense, not their main function. So the army asked for something lighter, something shorter, something easier to carry and faster to bring into action when things went sideways. That's the M1 Carbine, a .30 caliber semi-automatic weapon that weighed around 5.5 pounds unloaded compared to the Garand's 9.5 pounds. It was compact, it was quick handling, and it gave soldiers, who weren't primarily riflemen, a fighting chance if they suddenly found themselves in a firefight. Now here's where it gets interesting. Once the M1 Carbine started being issued, soldiers who weren't supposed to be the primary users of it started really liking it. Paratroopers especially took to it. So did soldiers operating in dense terrain, where a full-sized rifle was genuinely awkward. The weapon found a broader audience than originally intended, and that's when the real-world comparison to weapons like the StG44 became relevant. Let's give the StG44 its due, because it deserves it. The StG44 chambered an intermediate cartridge, the 7.92 by 33 mm Kurz, which was a deliberate compromise between a pistol round and a full rifle round. The idea was that most infantry combat actually happened at under 400 meters, and you didn't need the full power of a rifle cartridge for that. What you needed was something controllable enough to fire in bursts, with enough rounds to sustain that fire and enough energy to be effective at realistic combat distances. That thinking was genuinely revolutionary. It directly influenced the AK-47. It influenced NATO's shift to intermediate cartridges decades later. The concept behind the StG44 is what essentially shaped how every modern military in the world thinks about infantry rifles today. In terms of firepower, it was formidable. 30-round magazine, selective fire capability, you could go semi-automatic for accuracy or full auto for suppression. Effective range out to around 300 meters or so in practical terms. It hit hard enough to put people down reliably. And for a German infantryman fighting on the Eastern Front, holding a defensive line, or clearing a Soviet trench, it was an excellent weapon for the job. So why would anyone prefer the M1 Carbine over this thing? Several reasons, and they're more logical than you might expect. Here's something civilians and armchair historians often underestimate: how exhausting it is to carry weight over long distances, day after day, in harsh conditions. The STG44 weighed about 11.5 pounds when loaded. That's a heavy weapon. For comparison, the M1 Garand, already considered a fairly heavy service rifle, came in around 10 pounds loaded. The STG44 was actually heavier than the rifle it was supposed to improve on in terms of portability. The M1 Carbine, with a loaded 15-round magazine, right around 6 pounds, and soldiers loved that. Think about a paratrooper jumping into occupied France. He's already carrying ammunition, rations, grenades, a knife, possibly demo equipment, or a radio. Every pound matters enormously. The M1 Carbine, especially the folding stock M1A1 variant designed specifically for airborne troops, was a weapon you could actually manage while doing everything else a soldier had to do. Or think about a soldier in the Pacific. The jungle terrain there was unlike anything in Europe. Dense, wet, disorienting. Trails were narrow, visibility was often just a few meters. You were scrambling through undergrowth, crossing streams, climbing terrain that punished every unnecessary pound you carried. A short, light weapon wasn't just convenient, it was genuinely the right tool. Soldiers in those environments weren't just saying, "The carbine is lighter, that's nice." They were saying, "The carbine is what lets me actually move and fight effectively in this place." The STG44 didn't have a folding stock option that was widely fielded. It was a big, heavy weapon designed for soldiers whose primary role was combat. Take it out of that context, and the weight starts to feel less justified. Weight is one thing. Overall handling is another. The STG44 is 37 inches long. The standard M1 Carbine is 35.5 inches. Not a huge difference in raw numbers, but in confined spaces, every inch matters. Picture clearing a building. You're moving through doorways, turning corners, covering stairwells. A longer, heavier weapon is harder to swing around quickly. It catches on door frames. It's slower to bring to bear when someone appears 3 feet in front of you. Now picture a tank crew. What happens when your tank gets knocked out and you have to bail out and fight on foot? You've been operating in a metal box, and whatever weapon you had better be short enough to be practical in that environment. American tankers and vehicle crews were often issued the M1 Carbine for exactly this reason. Or picture a medic. Your hands are busy. You might have a wounded man you're trying to drag to cover. You need a weapon that you can sling effectively, that won't constantly get in the way, that you can bring up one-handed if absolutely necessary. The M1 Carbine fits that role. The STG44 was designed for a rifleman who planted himself, aimed, and fired. The M1 Carbine was designed for people whose job required them to move constantly, use their hands for other tasks, and only fight when they had no choice. For those people, the handling advantage of the carbine was real and significant. Combat weapons get dirty, they get wet, they get frozen, they get dropped in mud and sand and river water. And the question isn't how a weapon performs on a clean range, it's how it performs after weeks in the field. The StG44 was a relatively complex weapon for its era. It had more parts and tighter tolerances in certain areas. German manufacturing quality also varied considerably as the war went on, and resources became strained. Weapons made in 1944 and 1945 weren't always held to the same standards as earlier production runs. Soldiers reported issues with reliability, particularly in the harsh conditions of the Eastern Front winters. The M1 Carbine, by comparison, was a simpler operating system. It used a short-stroke gas piston. Clean, relatively uncomplicated, generally reliable. It had its issues too, and we'll talk about those honestly in a moment, but in terms of basic mechanical simplicity, the carbine held up well across a range of conditions. There's also the question of ammunition supply. This is huge, and it often gets overlooked. The StG44 used the 7.92 by 33 mm Kurz round, an entirely separate cartridge that had to be manufactured and distributed specifically for that weapon. The German logistics system toward the end of the war was, to put it charitably, a mess. Getting the right ammunition to the right place at the right time became increasingly difficult. The M1 Carbine used the .30 carbine round, which was standardized and produced in enormous quantities by American industry. The US supply chain was remarkably effective. A soldier with an M1 Carbine generally had ammunition. That's not a minor advantage. That's everything. A perfect weapon with no ammunition is useless. A good enough weapon with plenty of ammunition wins. Let's talk about the shooting experience, because this matters for understanding why soldiers either liked or disliked these weapons. The M1 Carbine had very light recoil. Very light. The .30 carbine round is a pistol-class cartridge in terms of energy, more powerful than a .30 ACP, weaker than a full rifle round, roughly in the range of something like a hot .357 Magnum. Firing it produced a sharp, manageable pop, rather than the heavy kick of a full-power rifle. For soldiers who weren't trained extensively as riflemen, officers, radio operators, cooks who ended up in unexpected firefights, that low recoil made the weapon significantly more accessible. You could put rounds on target without fighting the gun. Follow-up shots were fast and easy. The semi-automatic action meant you fired as fast as you could pull the trigger, which for close-range defensive situations was genuinely useful. And for some soldiers in the Pacific, dealing with Japanese soldiers charging at close range through dense jungle, fast, accurate close-range fire was exactly what they needed. The carbine's weakness at long range didn't matter if your engagement distances were measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters. The STG44 was also manageable in semi-automatic, but the full auto mode, while powerful on paper, was difficult to control. The weight helped somewhat, but sustained accurate fire in full auto is genuinely hard for most soldiers. And if you're using it in semi-auto most of the time anyway, the advantage over a fast semi-automatic carbine shrinks. Now, fairness requires that we talk about where the M1 Carbine genuinely struggled, because this is a real comparison, not a promotion. The biggest criticism of the M1 Carbine, the one that soldiers made most consistently, was about stopping power. The .30 carbine round was not a powerful cartridge, and there were documented complaints, particularly from Korea, but also from some Pacific veterans, about the round not reliably stopping enemy soldiers quickly enough. Some of this was ammunition-related. Early ball ammunition didn't expand, and at longer ranges, it lost energy quickly. Some of it was situational, heavily clothed enemies, adrenaline, the general chaos of close combat. But the complaints were real, and they were repeated often enough to be taken seriously. At range, the M1 Carbine dropped off significantly. Past 200 meters, the .30 carbine round lost energy fast. For a soldier who needed to engage enemies at 300 or 400 meters, the carbine was genuinely the wrong tool. The StG44, by comparison, hit harder at range. The 7.92 by 33 mm Kurz was a more powerful cartridge, and it maintained energy across the distances where infantry combat often occurred in European theater engagements. So, if you were a German infantryman holding the line against a Soviet advance across open ground, the StG44's performance advantage at medium range was real and meaningful. In that specific context, it was the better weapon. The point isn't that the M1 Carbine was better in every situation. The point is that for specific soldiers doing specific jobs in specific theaters, it was genuinely the right choice. This is a distinction that a lot of weapon comparisons completely ignore, and it fundamentally changes the analysis. The European theater of World War II, particularly the later stages, pushing through France, Belgium, Germany, involved a lot of open ground combat. Fields, roads, towns at range, soldiers engaging each other across distances where a rifle's performance really mattered. In that environment, a weapon with good medium-range performance was exactly what you wanted. The Pacific theater was different in almost every way. Fighting in places like Guadalcanal, New Guinea, the Philippines, or Okinawa meant dense jungle, tight terrain, extremely limited visibility, and engagements that often happened at very close range and very suddenly. The jungle compressed everything. Long-range performance mattered less when you couldn't see more than 30 meters in any direction. In that environment, the M1 Carbine's lightness, compactness, and fast handling were significant advantages. And the stopping power criticism? Pacific veterans had mixed views on it. Some absolutely had problems with the carbine's effectiveness. Others found it perfectly adequate for the ranges they were actually fighting at. Geography shapes tactics. Tactics shape weapon requirements, and weapon requirements determine what better actually means for any given soldier. A soldier fighting through the bocage of Normandy and a soldier fighting through the jungles of New Guinea needed different things. It's not surprising that they might reach different conclusions about which weapon they preferred. Here's a number that should give you pause. Approximately 6 million M1 carbines were produced during World War II. 6 million. The STG44, despite being rushed into production as urgently as possible, reached somewhere around 425,000 units by the end of the war. Some estimates go a bit higher, but we're talking less than 500,000 versus 6 million. That production gap tells you something important. The M1 Carbine was everywhere in the American military. It equipped not just the special role soldiers it was originally designed for, but paratroopers, rangers, marine raiders, and countless soldiers who simply ended up with one and found they liked it. It was available, it was reliable in terms of supply, and the ammunition for it was produced in quantities that matched the weapon's distribution. The STG-44, for all its tactical promise, never equipped the German military at the scale that would have been needed to make a decisive difference. Many German soldiers went through the entire war without ever touching one. The weapons that were produced were often sent to elite units or critical frontline formations, while ordinary soldiers kept their older rifles. So when we talk about which weapon was better, we have to ask, better for whom, and in what quantity? A weapon that exists in the hands of 6 million soldiers has a kind of practical effectiveness that numbers alone create, regardless of how it compares in technical specifications. If there's one group of soldiers where the M1 Carbine truly shined, it's the paratroopers. The American Airborne Forces, the 82nd Airborne, the 101st Airborne, adopted the M1 Carbine enthusiastically, and the M1A1 folding stock variant was specifically designed with them in mind. When you're jumping out of an airplane, the way your equipment is configured matters enormously. You need your weapon secure enough that it doesn't become a hazard during the jump, short enough that it doesn't interfere with your parachute, and light enough that it doesn't unbalance your load. The M1A1 with its folding stock checked all those boxes. Think about D-Day. Paratroopers jumping in darkness over Normandy, scattered across miles of Norman countryside, often landing alone or in small groups, trying to link up in the dark with no landmarks and enemies everywhere. In that situation, disoriented, possibly separated from your unit, moving through hedgerows and farmyards in the dark, a light, compact, fast-handling weapon was exactly what you wanted. The StG44 had no equivalent folding stock variant that was widely available to airborne troops. Even if a German paratrooper had access to one, the weight and size would have been more problematic for airborne operations. The M1 Carbine fit the airborne mission in a way that more powerful weapons simply didn't, and the soldiers who jumped with it generally trusted it. First-person accounts from veterans are always valuable, and they're complicated because soldiers' opinions varied widely based on their experiences. Some soldiers who carried the M1 Carbine loved it without reservation. Light, easy, fast, perfect for their job, exactly what they needed. Others had complaints, mostly about stopping power, occasionally about reliability in extreme cold. What's notable is that the soldiers who tended to be most positive about the M1 Carbine were precisely those it was designed for: officers, NCOs, support troops, paratroopers. The soldiers who were most critical were often those who ended up in heavy frontline infantry roles where they needed the weapon to perform like a rifle, and it wasn't designed to be a rifle. German soldiers who used the StG44 also had a range of opinions. Most who used it were positive about its firepower. There were complaints about weight, about reliability in extreme cold and mud, and about ammunition shortages. The soldiers who found themselves running low on 7.92 Kurtz ammunition with no resupply in sight had a very different opinion of their weapon than a soldier with a full ammunition load. Context shapes experience. Experience shapes opinion. And opinion is more useful than specifications when you're trying to understand what made a weapon work in the real world. Here's where we have to separate two different questions that often get confused. Question 1. Which weapon had a greater influence on the history of firearms design? The StG44 wins that one without much argument. The concept of the intermediate cartridge assault rifle is the dominant paradigm in military firearms today. The StG44 didn't invent every element of that concept, but it was the most complete early expression of it, and its influence on what came after, including the AK-47 and the subsequent shift to intermediate cartridges across NATO, is real and significant. Question 2. Which weapon was more useful to more soldiers in the actual circumstances of World War II? That's much more complicated, and the M1 Carbine has a stronger claim to practical utility for the specific context of the American war effort than it usually gets credit for. 6 million rifles issued. Paratroopers, officers, vehicle crews, support troops, all of them equipped with a weapon that was genuinely appropriate for their role. A supply chain that kept those weapons fed. A design that was light, reliable enough, and easy to use. That's a real contribution to winning a war, even if it doesn't inspire the same kind of admiration as a revolutionary design concept. The StG44 was arguably ahead of its time in concept, but underpowered in execution due to production limitations, logistics problems, and the desperate circumstances of the German war effort in 1944 and 1945. A revolutionary idea that arrived too late and in too few numbers to change the outcome. The M1 Carbine was exactly on time, in exactly the right quantities, doing exactly the job it was built for. Let's zoom out for a second, because there's a bigger idea here worth talking about. We have a tendency, and it's very human, to rank weapons, vehicles, and equipment in absolute terms. Best tank, best fighter plane, best rifle. And those rankings are fun, but they're also kind of misleading. Equipment doesn't operate in a vacuum. It operates in a specific military with specific logistics used by specific soldiers in specific terrain against specific enemies. Change any of those variables and the ranking changes. The StG44 was a better weapon than the M1 Carbine for a German infantryman fighting Soviet forces across open steppe or through European urban terrain, supplied with adequate ammunition and maintaining his weapon properly. The M1 Carbine was a better weapon than the StG44 for an American paratrooper jumping into Normandy, an officer commanding a platoon in Pacific jungle, a tank crewman who needed something compact in a bailout situation, or a radio operator who needed to keep his hands free while doing his actual job. Better is always better for whom, doing what, where. That's not a cop-out or a way of avoiding the comparison. It's actually the most accurate way to think about military equipment, and it's how good military planners and historians approach the question. So where does this leave us? The StG44 is genuinely one of the most historically significant firearms ever designed. The concept it embodied, controllable, intermediate power, high capacity, selective fire, became the template for nearly every military rifle in the world today. Calling it influential is an understatement. But the M1 Carbine was genuinely, practically effective in ways that deserve more recognition than it usually gets. It equipped millions of soldiers. It gave non-combat primary personnel a real fighting chance. It served paratroopers well in some of the most demanding operations of the war. It was light enough to carry all day without destroying your ability to function, and simple enough to work when things got rough. It wasn't perfect. The stopping power debate is real. The range limitations are real. For a frontline rifleman in open terrain, you'd want something more powerful. But for a significant portion of the soldiers who carried it, in the situations they actually found themselves in, the M1 Carbine wasn't a compromise or a second-best option. It was the right tool. And sometimes, the right tool beats the flashier tool. Not always, but sometimes. In the right hands, in the right place, at the right moment. Absolutely. So, do you still think the StG44 would always be the obvious choice? Hopefully this has given you a different angle on a comparison that usually gets treated as pretty one-sided. The history of World War II is full of these moments where the conventional wisdom is right in one context and completely wrong in another, and I find that genuinely interesting to dig into. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit the like button. It genuinely helps this kind of detailed, research-focused content reach more people who are into this stuff. And if you want to keep exploring the less obvious corners of World War II history, subscribe and stick around, because there's a lot more of this coming. Drop a comment below. What other weapon comparisons from World War II do you think deserve a more nuanced look? I read every comment, and a lot of the best future topics come from suggestions there. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.